We're now going to move on to young adulthood, still taking a look at the findings from the Minnesota longitudinal study. So young adulthood is a time for pulling together your past achievements, forging a plan for the future, moving towards being more self-sufficient, more autonomous. If you've had a solid foundation of emotional support, good peer relationships with positive peers, and at least adequate academic achievement and a chance for successful problem solving, you can draw on all of those experiences to create a meaningful life for yourself. If you don't have a positive history, the transition can be more challenging. Not impossible, obviously, but more challenges. The researchers in the Minnesota study were interested in how their participants negotiated this transition, and we're going to talk about those findings. So the person should have some kind of active involvement in preparing for self-sufficiency. Either they need to be making meaningful forays into the area of work, or they should be actively pursuing education or training opportunities that are going to support work or career. They should also be developing adult relationships and social support networks, although continuing to draw upon support from the family. And they should be evolving a sense of personal responsibility. This means that they understand that they are indeed the ones in charge of directing their own lives, and they should be developing the capacity to establish reasonable goals and the ability to appraise their progress towards those goals. In case you can't read the cartoon at the bottom, which is savage chickens, one chicken says, "You've got a problem with avoiding personal accountability." And the other chicken says, "Yeah, and whose fault is that?" So the researchers assessed the young adults' negotiation of these tasks both globally as well as more specifically. They conducted extensive interviews at age 19 that covered living arrangements, work, training and or education, and relationships with family and friends. They not only got the facts about the young person's circumstances, but also information regarding goals and aspirations, the setbacks that they had experienced, and what they were doing about those setbacks. From the interviews, the researchers made global ratings of adjustment and quality of their social support network. They also assessed the amount of life stress, physical and emotional health, and representation of childhood attachment using the Adult Attachment Interview, the AAI. A brief word about the AAI, the Adult Attachment Interview. It's a semi-structured interview about a person's childhood, and it measures mental representation of attachment in adults, although it has been modified for use with adolescents and even children, including disfluencies, false starts, pauses. It also requires extensive training on administration and coding. I've had the training, but I actually don't use the measure anymore because it's just too cumbersome. It takes way too long. But it is considered to be the gold standard in the measure of mental representation of attachment. This is different than self-report measures, which just ask the person to rate themselves. Self-report measures, although quite useful, and I use self-report myself, although they are useful, they can be subject to social desirability. The person might want to make themselves look good. So the AAI is the measure that was used in the Minnesota longitudinal study. It has some interesting questions in it. For example, one of the questions is, I want you to give me 5 adjectives that describe your relationship with your mother or father or caregiver, whoever their caregiver was. And then after they've given you those 5, you ask them to give you examples that illustrate why they chose that particular adjective. There's also questions about loss and trauma and parental discipline. The focus of the coding is not on what the person says, but how the person talks about their childhood relationships. So you could have a person that had a very difficult or traumatic childhood, but they've integrated it and now they're able to talk about it in a way that's coherent and isn't overwhelming for them. On the other hand, you could have someone who talks about having a wonderful, lovely childhood, but they have some lapses or slips, or they can't come up with any actual examples. And that leads you to believe that maybe their childhood wasn't really all that wonderful as they're trying to convince you. Again, it's how they talk about it. It's an important measure, and it's worth me spending a little time explaining it to you.